Terrific. Well, thank you, and I appreciate the conference organizers asking me to come down. I'm also particularly appreciative of the conference organizers arranging my co-author to be my discussant for the day. If you're in academia and you're worried about a discussant like criticizing your work, having that discussant's name on virtually everything that you're going to talk about is a nice guarantee or safeguard. So I'm very appreciative of that. I want to sort of frame what I want to talk about today as being something that's kind of sitting in the middle of some of the various papers and presentations and styles that you've been able to partake of. On one hand, we had in this morning some discussions about, what are going to be the ways that we drive immigration policy. Is it going to be firm-sponsored? Is it going to be something that's immigrant-sponsored and points-based systems? And we've just had some talks sort of about some of the outcomes in there. And I'm going to try to sort of weave a little bit into both of those domains and think a little bit about what has been some of the experience of the United States around its high-skilled immigration programs. I'm specifically going to try to pull out the firm side of it, which we haven't talked as much about. And then from that basic platform, try to say a little bit about how does this then map into the employer-sponsored nature of the visas, and what should we, how should we think about a little bit of that. So that's kind of a little bit of the talk today. It's rare that I would have to apologize by saying the U.S. is a land of immigrants. If you have come right behind an Israeli startup nation type paper, certainly this seems less in comparison, but it is helpful to go back and sort of note some of the overall trends respect to innovation and immigration here. That the U.S. has a history of immigration. It's a substantial share of our workforce, and it's been a substantial share of just the general growth in the workforce since 1995. So it's about a little less than a third of that. One thing that we've highlighted at several points, but I don't know that Lindsay went through a couple of numbers like this pretty quickly, but with respect to STEM work and more broadly innovation work in the United States, immigrants are also a particularly strong in terms of contribution numbers. So, roughly speaking, about a quarter of the bachelor's educated workers in the 2010 census that are engaged in STEM are foreign-born. A little less than 50% of maybe the doctorates at that level of higher education are there. And in calculations we've done for some of the earlier work we did, at least a majority of the growth since 1995 in terms of just the number of bodies and people that are working in this area can be, that net growth can be accounted for by higher rates of immigrant involvement. I'm going to come back to that phrase a little bit later, but just to note that just from a sheer kind of numbers perspective, there's a lot going on here. Now, I'm trying to get closer and faster towards the innovation themes. And so at points in time, I'll use STEM. I'm going to use innovation. Again, as Lindsay pointed out earlier, there's a difference between ideas and patents and commercialization. We'll blur a lot of those boundaries here and just try to talk about some of the bigger numbers and patterns that we're observing. So let me get a little bit with the innovation side. Unfortunately, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, in releasing its patents, does not have specific identifiers for foreign-born individuals. You do know whether the person lives in the United States or not, but you don't know their nationality. So one thing that in a series of work with Bill and other people have tried to understand what we could learn from the data, taking people's names into account, trying to say what's the ethnic composition of inventors. So the idea is to say if you have Bill Kerr on a patent, very likely you're talking about a U.S. native person, American. If you have someone's name that's distinctly European or distinctly Chinese or Indian, Patel, Ghosh, etc., Banerjee, you're going to think a lot that that's someone that's from that region of the world. And so we can, once you sort of buy into this, and I'll be using this at several points in today's brief talk, you can start to say a lot more about the various compositions of Intel's workforce or Harvard's workforce or Microsoft's workforce for innovation, because you actually have this assignment that's been done at the very micro level of patents. So just as some background here, this uses patents that were granted up through 2010 and asks what share of the people living in the United States when they made the patent came from various ethnic origins. So these are, again, people that live somewhere within the 50 states, and what were the ethnic names in the patents. So if you go back to 1975, the vast majority, there's a big group that's somewhere up here that's called Anglo-Saxon. that's not on this chart for obvious reasons. That group was 80% of the names that were filed in patents were of Anglo-Saxon origin. And Chinese, Indian, and others were under 2% at that time. It's very, very low contributions. Over the last 30 years, that's been a tremendous expansion. The Anglo-Saxon share would have fallen about 10% or 12% off of where it was in 1975. And through that period of time, most of that has been increase in the number of Chinese-related contributions, and also an increase in the number of Indian contributions. But most other non-Anglo-Saxon and non-European categories have been increasing that way. Of course, this is different from immigration. It's ethnicity. So I can't say whether someone with the last name Wang is second generation or first generation. But you can take these numbers and, for example, look at how many people in the census of Chinese ethnicity came, as a first-generation immigrant. And you can find that this has a lot of correlation and value in that respect. So from this and from WIPO data and from other stuff, you can often think that sort of matching the numbers that I began with in terms of the number of people working in STEM-related occupations, measures of innovation are often going to come out somewhere in the 20-25% kind of ballpark as well. That's kind of the level of pieces that we can trace back to people of foreign origin. And just to note that this has not deteriorated in the recent years, this is actually using now applications to the Patent Office, regardless of whether they've been granted, so we can take it even further in time. And the patterns are still going up there. So on these things, you find about a quarter is the panel has parts that are related to entrepreneurship. We take surveys of Silicon Valley firms, surveys of like IPO firms, surveys of the Inc. 100, and look at those. You often find that, again, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 25%, 30%, something along those lines. All of these academics are very, very good at quibbling. All of these surveys are things you can go through and quibble quite extensively with, but at the same time, I also think they're generally directionally correct in terms of the magnitudes that they're getting. So let me try to now take that next step and say, well, how are we going to think about moving this through to the potential impact for U.S. innovation, but also the potential impact for firms that are engaged in this process. And I want to divide this into the two Qs, quantity and quality. We just talked about the quantity side, so let me put that on hold for a second. Let's talk about the quality side. Now, Jennifer told me that she was unable to actually give a presentation at today's talk because she would need President Obama's signature on the document in order for her to say something public. So I'm going to say a few things on her behalf, because Jennifer has basically been, along with others, leading part of this charge, and Paula Stefan as well. So on one hand, you have a set of work that's talked about the extreme tail of immigrant contributions. This goes back to some of Paula's early stuff that says, take the number of Nobel Prize winners, take the election National Academy of Sciences, take top-ranked patents and similar, and you tend to find that there's a large number of, a disproportionate share of those are immigrant origin. Lindsay actually showed an interesting graph a little bit earlier that says maybe some of that's declining in relative shares more recently as we've come a little bit further, but it's still a case that we'd still find disproportionate numbers overall. On the opposite side, we have some of Jennifer's work, which has been looking at how does the typical immigrant compare to the typical native in terms of patenting or entrepreneurship or various outcome variables. And then let's try to see how much we can explain of this away. And I hope I get this right. I should get it right. If you start with just the raw differences across the groups, you find an immigrant advantage. So immigrants are more likely to patent, they're more likely to start new firms, they're more likely to publish scientific articles. Once you control for the immigrant's education level, so whether they got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or a doctorate degree, and once you control for the field of study, for most things you can actually explain that away. There's a little bit that stays left for entrepreneurship and some other categories like that, but you can pretty much explain the difference there. So on one hand, I have the notion of that we have in general been coming towards this relatively similar aggregates, with the important thing that's conditional on education and field of study. And then we also have this extreme tail of quality that exists as well. So if you're thinking about the next Albert Einstein, we're more likely than the 16% of the US population to probably pull that someone from the immigrant side. But on general, when you look at science and engineering, we're able to explain a lot. Now, this is a little bit of where a reference point is exceptionally important. And I haven't had anyone, I think, yet use the phrase today, best and brightest? You know, what's the degree to which immigrants represent the U.S.'s best and brightest? And here there is a critical reference point question. You can look at Jennifer's work and say that, well, once these people are in the science and engineering fields, and once they've been trained for that, they're no different than the average native that is in that field. And that answer is yes, conditional on making those trainings and investments. They're showing the same overall output and aptitude in that zone. On the other hand, if you want to compare that to our overall rate of low-skilled immigration or to the average person in the U.S. economy or similar, then they're going to rank much higher because they have made investments in their education and training and skills and chosen jobs to push in that zone. So there's kind of the reference point here of how you want to think about this quality is important, but I'm trying to come to grips more and more personally with thinking about this long tail of exceptional contributions, and then also the fact that much of the mainstream contribution of immigrants comes through people that they've just been trained to be chemical engineers, and so that's what they're going to do. A few kind of caveats or extra notes to add in here. One place that we've recently seen some maybe additional divergence emerging in terms of immigrants versus natives are people that have looked at PhD programs and the quality of the students that are within those programs. Sometimes you see a little bit more of a gap that's emerging in those groups. And likewise, I don't think we yet understand how well things sort of maybe spill out of the superstars into the general population and help it develop more. So on one hand, you can imagine that the superstars sort of set out agendas and ideas and create new things, and everyone benefits from that. We also see in many graduate student labs clustering of immigrants around a superstar researcher. So there may be some sort of connection there that we've yet to disentangle. So given this notion, I want to now next think about what's the impact and what do we know about the impact for U.S. workers. And so I'm thinking here U.S. Native American workers. And part of my reason for going there is that I'm going to take out this top part here. I'm going to subtract out the superstars. I'm going to say if the quality is pretty much going to be the same conditional on the investments, then it really comes around the quantity and how that quantity impacts the other, whether or not other people that are of American origin stay in various fields or not. Does that make sense? So if the means of the groups are roughly similar, we have large contributions coming of immigrants. We need to think about what the natives are and how that compares. One sort of point I should make going back to this morning presentation about Lindsay and others that have been here, there's been this talk about it's about the selectivity, it's not the overall numbers. I'm actually saying here it's about the numbers, not the selectivity, but it's only because I'm going now to that group that's already been selected. So we're talking about the higher skilled in the contribution here about the STEM work. So how are we adding up this larger impact? The way economists have approached this for a long period of time, and we've seen some examples of it today, is to try to define what we think the labor market is and then look for the various impacts that has. This goes back to traditional economics 101, that you would have the quantity of workers on here, you have the wages that are being paid, you have a labor supply curve. If you pay more wages, people are going to want to work more or want to demand more work. And then you have the labor demand curve by firms that's going in the opposite direction. If firms have to pay lower wages, they may want to hire more workers and similar. This is a model that's very simple relative to what Herbert introduced and others, but it's kind of a starting point for thinking about some of these issues. And what we traditionally think about immigration is to say, well, if we're going to have this labor supply curve be natives plus immigrants, then if you have immigration, you shift out this labor supply curve. And so you may be, everything else being equal, you move down the labor demand curve and you pay lower wages, but you have more people that are employed, higher quantities, and similar. There's no unemployment in this model. There's nothing like that. So it's really simple, but it helps to start fix the idea. And then lots of the questions then happen is, okay, does everything else stay equal? Or do natives move out of that area, in which case the labor supply curve doesn't actually shift down here. It shifts down, but then shifts back. Do firms increase their demand? What all goes on in this? When thinking about the labor market and the innovation outcomes for immigration, we followed a lot of this, the procedures that Herbert outlined in some of his work with our studies around this. So some of the first line of research focused on labor markets. I have work with Bill Lincoln that's using cities and the H-1B program in this regard. Jenny has work at the state level using this regard. Giovanni Perry recently went back and did some productivity work at the city level in this respect. These studies tend to find positive effects of this program. So they tend to find that if you're having more H-1B workers admitted nationally into the United States, Cities that are dependent upon H-1B workers are more likely to have innovation boosts that come out of that. Giovanni's work would say there's more productivity impacts that follow on and similar. So we tend in this kind of work not to find that natives are being crowded out of the programs and that then you're getting some sort of net increase. And my personal take on it is mainly through the quantity side rather than through the quality dimensions or differentials that way. This is not the only approach one may take. One may instead think about occupations. Here, I think there's been much more varied outcomes. There are two very well-placed, highly talked about studies. One looked at Russian mathematicians in the 1990s following the mass increase in migration to the United States from Russian mathematicians. And they found negative effects. They found crowding out effects moving out of these areas. There's also been studies of immigrants for chemical engineering when from the Nazi Germany expulsion. They found lots of positive effects and growth in the size of fields. So at this point, I think there's a lot of variance in what we find here. And then there's student majors and the choices of young college freshmen and college sophomores about what they want to pursue. Pia and Madeline have been working on some of these things. This is a place where I struggle to find something that argues there's lots of crowding in effect. So I don't see as much evidence to say that when you're having lots of Chinese students come in and compete for some engineering, let's say mechanical engineering slots, that's somehow increasing the demand of Americans to enter in that area as well. But that could be incomplete, but it is sort of my instinct across this. So behind these, there's several key questions to pull out. One question is that we always need to think about is how well does this actually model the labor market? So if we're thinking about local areas, how well does Boston or does the Silicon Valley or Cleveland actually model the decisions in the firms and what happens with high-skilled immigration? And we'll use Microsoft as an example since Bill Kamel is going to be coming up a little bit later. What's the labor market for Microsoft? Is it Seattle, around its plant? Is it worldwide because they're in so many different places? Like we have to think that there's a mobility of high-skilled immigration across zones as well as also across countries. So that's complicated. And this is porous borders for many different things. The second thing is on the role of growth. How many growth opportunities do you have in order to deploy immigrants and then build complementary resources around them? So if you go back to that Russian mathematician example, a lot of them were employed in universities that were very constrained for further growth. So it may have become a fight for the access to resources and limited opportunities for expansion that way, and that can very much govern the degree to which you find a push-out effect or a crowding-out effect relative to a general growth phenomenon. And then finally, kind of thinking about more broadly, now getting to a point that I want to go into a little more deeply, is we need to start thinking much more about who is acting in these programs. And what I really want to focus is goes back to earlier conversations to note that the H-1B and many of the skilled immigration into the United States is driven by firms. So that I don't need to, there's an audience that has deep experience in immigration, don't need to go through the fact that when Microsoft is looking to hire an H-1B worker, they first identify the worker, they then make a visa on behalf of that worker, they then have, if the visa is granted subject to the cap, a guaranteed sort of period of time where they're going to be working with that worker, they may sponsor that worker for a green card on the back end. There's a lot of role for the firm in that process. Now, why does that matter? Well, one systematic way it matters is just looking at this graph. You can think about, well, I began by this hypothetical thought experiment, the labor supply curve shifting, and then firms were somewhere in here, but they were just sort of in the background. Like they kind of, they reacted to this. Now we have a set of policies and visas that are designed to say firms are going to be picking out when they want to bring somebody in, how much they want to bring in, where they want to locate them, and similar. And that means that we need to start thinking much more about this labor demand side. How does that interact with this? To give one graphical example of this, this is the H-1B program's composition on a yearly basis as best I was able to construct it from things. We can talk later about how difficult some of these data are to find. But I just picked out the number of people that came from India and the number of people that were related to the computer occupations broadly defined. And just trust me on the concordance that I created. So you can go back to in the mid-1990s, actually the H-1Bs used for STEM work was substantially less than what we think about today. India was about a quarter, about a fifth. Computer was about a quarter. You then had the tech boom in the 90s where that increased dramatically up to 60% and 50%. Then you had the nuclear winter in telecom and various IT fields, which dropped that back down to a third. Then you go to 2008, you go back up to 50%, and today we're somewhere, let's say, 2/3 of the program. If you think about this, this is fairly dramatic changes that happened over a very short period of time in terms of the composition of the program. And this is our main vehicle for bringing people in. And that's not so difficult to trace back to the fact that it is a non-priced program. It is first come, first served basis, and it's subject to some overall cap, that has to be done. And so you could have the people move in and out of the program back and forth, and that's got a lot of consequences when we go back to thinking about a framework like this of saying if the program is designed to bring in the workers that firms want, we have to put ourselves a lot more in the shoes of the firms and ask, what are they going to be using this visa program for? What are the economics of the firm, and how would they differ from a traditional model around labor economics and similar? So maybe we can kind of continue on this line a little bit later and discuss this. But I think this is something that for economists studying this issue and for the direction of policy to think about, there's a lot that we have to grapple with related to the fact that when you have it created around the firm, it has incentives, and we need to consider that. To give one example of this, and I will probably close on this slide, or maybe go to the next one, is that when we think about immigration and those labor markets, we often began by saying there's some labor market for computer workers, there's some labor market for accountants, there's some labor market for market design people, and similar. And if you're talking about a large company that is bringing together all these workers into one place, that company is going to be internalizing the spillovers or changes across various groups. And so if you have, we'll take the Microsoft Corporation, if Microsoft is employing non-STEM people, STEM people, executive management, 75% of its workforce outside the United States and related, it has to be thinking about how the economics of all this stuff add up together in order to do that. That means that it becomes much more important to think about the spillovers across occupations. If you increase the STEM employment in one area, does that lead Microsoft to hire more marketing people in another area to support them? If Microsoft is, for example, looking at an occupation where it's very easy to substitute between young and older workers, you may have that we would traditionally think in the George Borhouse sense that immigrants and natives would be working down here and down here. But if, in fact, you can substitute all across young and old, then all of this group becomes one pool of workers that Microsoft could pull from. And that will differ across occupations and how they relate to each other. So that's something that we need to think a lot more about it. And we need to think a lot more about the fact that 75% of these workers for Microsoft are going to be outside of the United States or something approximate to that. And so you have a skilled immigration policy that's set in a much larger dynamics of the firm and how they go. So last couple things on the firm level findings. Overall, when we look at dependent firms and increases in the high skilled immigration, we tend to find a range of pay differential studies. Some are giving positive, some are giving negative, some are giving closer to zero. I think there's a lot of variance that's still out there. In the work that we've done, we find overall growth in the firm employment that is behind this, so the firms are expanding. This is particularly true among young workers. It's particularly true among complementary workers and related. This is connecting into greater rates of innovation and patenting for the workers. And overall, this then seems to affect how their global operations to other firms are and how they take advantage of those things. So thank you.